Okay, welcome back. Video 2, we're going to talk about the types of studies that are conducted in nutrition science. The first type of study that we'll talk about is called a population study, and these are observational. There's not an intervention like there was in the example of the scientific method that we talked about in the first video. So what we're looking for in a population study is basically a certain chronic disease versus a certain cause of death compared to certain populations. Specifically, scientists may collect information about a specific population's health and food-related practice by surveys. This is really common for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which being that it's pretty inexpensive. And since we can't just change someone's diet in a way that we think is probably harmful to their health, because that would be unethical. Population studies are one of the best ways that we have as scientists to figure out what types of food patterns of intake, what types of diet patterns are more risky for health. So surveys can include personal histories, medical histories, dietary practices, environmental exposures, and there's a whole huge set of data around these large population studies. A great example of this is the Framingham Heart Study. This began in 1949 in Framingham, Massachusetts. There were over 5,000 healthy participants, and basically they followed those participants over several decades and collected all kinds of really specific data at very specific intervals of time, and analyzed it to figure out what their health outcomes of that population was, and if there were any relationships to lifestyle or nutrition factors. From that, they were able to identify a number of different risk factors for heart disease specifically, because that's what they were looking for. And that study was such a landmark, huge success as far as identifying health disease risks that it's actually still going on. Many medical researchers are still collecting info from both the original Framingham Heart Study participants and their descendants, so their children and grandchildren as well. We're getting a lot of really good information from there. And you may notice, if you or someone you know goes to a cardiologist, that there are actually Framingham Heart risk scores based on what we learned from this Framingham Heart Study. Something kind of interesting about that, when we look at medical research in general, is that Framingham, Massachusetts, as you might imagine, is not a very diverse city, which isn't necessarily reflective of the U.S. population, seeing that not everyone is white in America. So there is some discussion in the medical community about whether or not the Framingham Heart Study outcomes can be extrapolated or applied to other minority groups. And then, Framingham, Massachusetts is a very specific area of the country. So that's another thing to consider. I mean, those people are going to have very different exposures, stressors, and potentially very different daily lives than someone who lives in the opposite corner of the U.S. in, say, Hawaii or San Diego. So there's a lot of limitations when we focus on one particular population or one particular location, but this data is still very good because of the breadth of it and the length at which they were able to collect that information. Very important to note about population studies or observational studies is that they cannot establish cause and effect. All we can say from looking at population data is that, for example, consuming more salt seems to lead to high blood pressure or seems to lead to increased risk for high blood pressure. The way that we would have to determine whether consuming extra salt does actually cause, so determine a cause and effect relationship between two variables, would be to give a population of people a lot of extra salt and measure their blood pressure compared to a population who did not receive a bunch of extra salt. As you might imagine, since we are pretty well certain that a high sodium diet leads to high blood pressure, that's not something that any ethical review board is going to be okay with, and that's why those studies don't exist. So another kind of study is called a human intervention study. And this is where research is going to be applied to the specific human situation. An intervention or experimental study. This is how we can determine whether a health condition results from a specific dietary practice. Now, as I alluded to with the past slide, that's a challenge to do, because if we have a suspicion that a particular dietary practice is going to increase health risks, increase disease or death, that's not ethical to force a population of people to do that. So it's kind of a challenge as far as nutrition and physical activity research goes. This is a big challenge with our data. So the gold standard of research, the only type of study that can really truly establish whether one particular variable causes a particular outcome, like does chemical X cause gastric cancer, does sodium cause hypertension or high blood pressure, is a double-blind randomized controlled trial. In a double-blind randomized controlled trial, there's the treatment and the control group, just like in the example we talked through in the last video. But in this case, neither the treatment group or the control group knows which is which. So the researchers don't know which subjects are in the treatment or control groups, and the subjects don't know whether they are in the treatment or control group. And that's really important, because that secrecy allows us to provide a treatment without the placebo effect, and it also helps us to eliminate some researcher bias. So if, for example, I work for a salt factory. This is a crappy example, so I apologize. Let's say I work for a salt factory and I want to establish that salt does not raise blood pressure. So if I'm doing a study giving human subjects salt, then I am biased against those. I'm going to look for other things that could be contributing to my participants who received extra salts increased blood pressure, like lack of activity, errors in the math, a whole host of things. And so that's going to really seriously affect the validity of my results, because I have a bias as a researcher. To that same effect, there's widely known effects of placebo. And the placebo is when you're getting a perceived treatment. So maybe you are in some kind of, vitamin study. And instead of giving you the vitamin, they're giving you a sugar pill or something that does nothing. But it looks exactly like the vitamin pill. And so you don't know whether or not you don't know whether or not you're getting the vitamin or the placebo, which is the fake. And what that does for research is it keeps you from attributing any increase or improvement in symptoms from the placebo. So if you say that you're getting better, like, hooray, my symptoms are better, I'm doing a lot better on this particular pill that I've been getting through this study, and then it turns out that you were just getting a sugar pill or whatever the placebo is, then, we can all establish that the placebo effect might have had a bigger impact on those outcomes than the actual treatment. It's kind of a confusing thing. Please let me know in the message boards if you have questions about that. So hopefully you're getting a little bit better sense of why there is a lot of confusion and a lot of conflicting results generated by nutrition studies. and which for consumers certainly can be disappointing and confusing and frustrating. And it makes it look like scientists and nutritionists don't know what they're doing. Why can't we just agree and provide proof that eating specific foods benefits health? And, well, that would be so great from my perspective as a nutrition scientist. That would be amazing. I would love to have definitive proof that eating specific foods affects everyone's health in specific ways. But realistically, coming to that conclusion is a lot more challenging than it sounds. And because there are so many other impacting factors on human health, it's really impossible to eliminate those from all of our studies. So the reason why we keep getting these conflicting results is because I don't think that we've identified all the things that affect human health. Like genetics, we're just starting to come into the field of nutrigenetics, which is studying how different nutrients affect specific genes and how different genetic mutations affect our ability to utilize nutrients. That's a really new area of practice and research, and it's going to take a while for us to sort of parse out how that affects people's diets. And then, of course, there are always reports before we get answers, just like the butter lowers blood sugar study that I was kind of alluding to earlier. In this one particular study a few years ago, people who ate butter fats had lower blood sugars than their peers. I honestly don't remember the full design of the study, but that was just one particular study. It wasn't a whole group of studies, and there's a whole host of things that affect blood pressure or blood sugars, including sleep, stress. What else do you eat with your butter? I mean, if you're eating a lot of butter on top of broccoli, then I would expect that would not raise your blood sugars. If you're eating a lot of butter in the form of a cake or buttercream frosting, I would expect that your blood sugars would rise. So there's just a lot more to it. And it's it's impossible to eliminate all researcher bias. So you will notice that lots of researchers kind of embark upon a particular path. It's sort of their calling to research a particular nutrient, and they get a little absorbed in realizing all the wonderful things that their particular nutrient does for the human body or for the particular health outcome. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we want people who are experienced to be able to design studies to answer the questions that we need answered about nutrients. But at the same time, it can mean that people are a little bit biased in really seeking and searching through their data, or called data parsing, to find results that echo their opinions. And then we know population studies, observational population studies involving people and their eating practices cannot establish cause and effect, whether a particular practice is responsible for a particular health outcome. And those are certainly the most cost-effective studies to perform, and they're also, in most levels, the most ethical. It's really expensive to control someone's whole environment and everything that they eat. Not everybody is going to be up for that. It usually means keeping somebody in a lab for weeks at a time, with all of their meals provided and limited outside contact, which humans don't live in controlled environments like that. Most of us aren't able to devote that kind of time to a controlled environment like that. So there's a whole lot of influential factors. And the media, because they're excited and people want to hear these stories, sometimes gets a little ahead of themselves with reporting headlines on particular studies before the rest of the scientific community has caught up with that. So, cause and effect. This is a really essential point that I need you to remember. Personal pet peeve. Correlation does not equal causation. Population studies involving people and their eating practices cannot establish cause and effect. Anybody notice how many times I've said that today? Maybe somebody should write that down, highlight it, circle it. This is probably going to come back to haunt you later, by the way. Multiple risk factors, including genetic susceptibility to develop diseases, usually influence the development of chronic disease. So there's just no way to look at these big population studies, which are the majority of nutrition studies, and determine any sort of causative effect from one thing to another. And as a way to illustrate this, I have this really fun website that I'd like to bring up and show you all. Spurious causations, or spurious correlations, rather. So, U.S. spending on science, space, and technology is very positively correlated to suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. Clearly, one has nothing to do with the other, but they're very positive, almost follow exactly the same trend line, which is pretty weird. People who drowned by falling into a pool correlates with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. That is a really strange correlation. You can see that the two lines, the number of films Nicolas Cage appeared in, is almost exactly equal over a 10-year period with the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool. Clearly, Nicolas Cage being in a movie has nothing to do with whether or not somebody is going to drown or fall into a pool. But they are very well correlated. Per capita cheese consumption correlates with number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Yeah, that probably has nothing to do with people becoming tangled in their bed sheets. But nonetheless, very similar. The divorce rate in Maine correlates with per capita consumption of margarine. So it looks like margarine consumption has declined along with the divorce rate in Maine. I doubt very seriously that those are related. And there's a whole host of these. And I'd encourage you to just sort of scroll through them because they're kind of funny. But basically, the point that I really want to get across to you here is just because two data points appear to be correlated does not mean that one has caused the other. If there is some kind of relationship between them, some sort of causative relationship, we can't determine what that is from a population study because it's impossible to determine which item came before. Worldwide non-commercial space launches with sociology doctorates. I mean, there's no way that those are connected. They just happen to follow a similar trend line. So look through these on this website if you are interested in a little giggle. And remember, correlation does not equal causation.